Good. Okay. Right, you're all set to go then.
So it's recording already?
This is recording. So the mic is on now. I'm just gonna double check these two are loud enough. But other than that, you should be fine. Okay, no problem.
Two, two, 1, 2. Two, 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 1, 2.
Dove sei? Detto, ci sono i posti consolari per esempio. No, sta qui ancora missione, 20 giorni. Dopo in aprile vado a casa io ma per 5 giorni. Comunque rivedo che in giugno 5 giorni. Poi un anno questo comunque. In agosto.
Buonasera. Good evening. My name is Arianna Dagnino, and I am the Cultural Events Coordinator of the Dante Alighieri Society of BC here in Vancouver, a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of Italian language and culture. On behalf of the Dante Society and SFU's Graduate Liberal Studies, I am delighted to welcome you tonight to this particular event, a talk by Professor Emily O'Brien on Rescuing Florence, Stories of a Renaissance City Under Siege. It's a fascinating topic, and I dare say, strongly resonates with our increasingly divisive and conflict-ridden times, offering valuable historical insights that might still hold lessons for us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Wosk Center for Dialogue is located on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of the Consular Corps joining us this evening. We are especially honored by the presence of the Consul General of Italy, Mr. Paolo Miraglia del Giudice, who will now offer a few words of welcome.
Buonasera a tutti, good evening everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dante Alighieri Association, its president Renato Zani, Arianna Dagnino for organizing this extraordinary and very engaging talk by Professor O'Brien, dedicated to the siege of Florence in 1529. It was a defining moment in Italian history that not only reshaped the destiny of Florence, but also the political landscape of the Renaissance, leaving a profound impact on art, literature, and historical thought. In fact, the siege was more than a military conflict. It was a battle for republican ideals, for the identity of Florence, and for the very soul of Renaissance, a dramatic confrontation between civic republicanism and the forces of imperial and papal authority. The siege marked the end of an era, the fall of the last great Renaissance republic, and the rise and subsequent consolidation of Medici power, altering the course of Italian history. It also inspired artistic, intellectual responses that continue to resonate today. Michelangelo, for instance, not only contributed to the city fortifications, but later saw his art influenced by the trauma and disillusionment of this period. So we are very excited to listen to Professor O'Brien and explore this crucial chapter from multiple perspectives, military, political, social, cultural, as well as its legacy, which continue to shape our understanding of politics, art, and historical narrative. Ultimately, the siege of Florence underscores the fragility of republics in the face of realpolitik, confirming many of Machiavelli's insights about power, military strength, and political survival that I would say are still relevant today more than ever. So thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to the talk of Professor O'Brien. Thank you very much.
We at the Dante Society are deeply grateful to SFU's Graduate Liberal Studies for their collaboration and generous support in making this event possible. To offer a few words of welcome, I now invite Professor Sasha Kobe, Director of SFU's Graduate Liberal Studies, to the stage.
Good evening, buonasera a tutti. We're really thrilled to have these two groups together here tonight, bringing together liberal studies. It's a master's program for working adults, people who are interested in delving deeply into the history of ideas and how we got to where we are, and also the Dante Alighieri Society, which in its own way is very much doing the same thing. Please, GLS students, have a look at what the Dante Society is doing, all the events they offer. And please, Dante supporters, have a look at what Graduate Liberal Studies is doing with our field schools and our food history school coming up in Rome in the fall. Hopefully very soon, a field school offered by our wonderful professor, full of passion and so inspiring to me, Emily O'Brien. Thank you, Ariana, for organizing. This was one of the easiest yeses we could ever say, was to work in collaboration with you on this. We thank everyone for being here tonight. And as everyone has said, to bring communities together, from my daughter, Tatiana, 13, Emily's son, 13, to some of our students, all the way up to 80, all here together, looking to the past for inspiration, being here in the spirit of ideas, and resisting a culture that denies accuracy, rigor, and community.
Before introducing tonight's speaker, I would like also to briefly invite our president, Renato Zane, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Professor. We look forward, those of us at the Dante Society, to learning more about your program and all of the wonderful things that are happening here at SFU. And it's so nice to see so many familiar faces. And I look forward, as the representative of the Dante Society, to learn more about all of the interesting work that's being done here at SFU. Very briefly, I just wanted to say, Dante Alighieri, a Florentine, lived about 200 years before the events that we are going to hear about this evening. I accidentally touched your mouse. I'm sorry, Professor. Well, let me read you the presentation. No, I'm just kidding. As you know, he was an exceptional poet, philosopher, and even an emissary to Rome in his own troubled times. Dante is best known for his epic work, La Divina Commedia, considered by many to be the greatest literary work of the Italian language. It made an impact not only in the late Middle Ages, but it resonated well into the Renaissance. Today, the Dante Alighieri Society has more than 450 chapters in over 80 countries around the world. We are a nonprofit organization for the promotion of Italian language and culture. The Dante Society of BC organizes many cultural events. This is a wonderful collaboration, but Arianna also puts together an incredible program during the course of the year. And we also offer online courses in Italian from beginners to advanced learners, with small classes and really wonderful Italian teachers. So if you're planning a trip to Italy or are interested in things Italian, please consider signing up. Also, for those who need an official language certification to emigrate to Italy, the Dante Society is recognized by the Italian government as an official certification center. Our next exams are scheduled for June, so that's another piece of information I wanted to share with you. We also offer several book clubs where members come together to discuss well-known works by Italian writers. So we would love also to see the participation, the sense of community that you were talking about through membership. An annual membership of the Dante Society is $40 for the year. It gives you access to all free, all paid cultural events, as well as discounts on some of the language courses. So to find out for more information, if you're interested, the website is dantesocietybc.ca. And while you're there, you can also sign up for the wonderful newsletter that provides information on a regular basis. So having said that, I just wanted to say, like you, I'm looking forward to this evening's talk on the Siege of Florence. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And now let me introduce the speaker of tonight, Professor Emily O'Brien. Dr. Emily O'Brien is associate professor in SFU's History and Global Humanities departments, specializing in the Italian Renaissance with a focus on 15th century humanism, politics, and the papacy. She's the author of the Commentaries of Pope Pius II and the Crisis of the 15th Century Papacy, and considers Italy her intellectual home. Tonight, Professor O'Brien will take us back to Renaissance Florence in the year 1529, when the city was besieged by imperial troops. And she will explore this pivotal moment in history, shedding light on the resilience and sacrifices of Florentine citizens to protect their city and its artistic and cultural treasure. Please join me in welcoming Professor O'Brien to the podium.
Buonasera. It is a delight to be here this evening to see. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. It is such a pleasure to be here at the podium about to deliver a lecture to this group, bringing together two worlds that I care about so much, or more than two. The Dante Society, which has offered so many wonderful events, so many opportunities to come back to Italy while I am stranded here in Vancouver, I feel sometimes. And of course, the GLS friends and family that I see here, along with many SFU colleagues. And I want to thank everyone in GLS and everyone at the Dante Society for making this event happen. It has taken many months, much work, and also that we can travel to Florence, and any opportunity that I can have to return to this marvelous city, which I had the great pleasure and privilege of spending a year in on a sabbatical 2 years ago. I seize that opportunity. So welcome to Florence tonight. High atop a hill to the south of the Arno River and overlooking the city of Florence stands the medieval church of San Miniato al Monte. It is named after one of the city's earliest patrons, an Armenian soldier and an early Christian martyr by the name of Minius, or in Italian, Miniato. In the mid-13th century, after confessing that he followed the Christian faith, imperial soldiers made repeated and unsuccessful attempts to kill him. They eventually beheaded him on the bank of the Arno River, but legend tells us that that was not the end. For the now headless Miniato bent down, picked up his head, and carried it up this hill to where his hermitage was and where he was eventually buried. It was here on his remains that Florentines first built a shrine and eventually an 11th century basilica, a magnificent example of the Tuscan Romanesque style. San Miniato remains one of the great architectural and spiritual treasures of the city. And here is the city from the top of that hill. The story of San Miniato's martyrdom can be read as one of fortitude, survival against all odds, the spiritual triumph of a soldier even in the context of his bodily defeat. And these meanings make this church a fitting place for the events that took place in the fall of 1529, right here, with the church as the protagonist. For it was at San Miniato in October that the siege of Florence began. And here where the city showed its own remarkable fortitude, its survival against all odds, and staged a critical triumph in the context of what would eventually be a defeat 10 months later, not because of bombardment against its resilient fortifications, but by a slow and agonizing war of attrition. If the siege of Florence is unfamiliar to you, you are hardly alone. And perhaps it's not surprising. A city that has such a rich history with literary giants and artistic masterpieces that are the envy of so many other places, it's hard to compete for attention. Though there are other reasons that I'll suggest in the course of my talk why I think this event has yet to capture the imagination of the public and why its scholarship is comparatively minimal and still mostly in Italian. It is certainly not for a lack of stories that are captivating, something I discovered almost immediately as I explored the siege in the context of my own research project on civic consciousness in 15th and 16th century Italy. And when I went on to teach a course on the city of Florence, inspired in large part by these stories. Nor is the siege lacking in star power. Indeed, quite the opposite. It has, in my opinion, the perfect recipe for drawing students into my courses, the 3 M's: Machiavelli, Michelangelo, and the Medici. And I would argue that the siege is intimately and if indirectly connected to the accomplishments of many other famous artists and architects. If the Florentines had not responded to the siege the way that they did, we might not have the works of artists and architects like these. Botticelli, Giotto, Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, and Ghiberti. And I could proceed with an entire slideshow and not come close to covering all of the other artists and treasures that the Florentines saved. And it is with that idea in mind that I'm giving my talk this evening with the focus of rescue, rescuing Florence. And I'd like to tell my story in 3 different stages. What did it mean to rescue the city of Florence? What and who were involved? What did it take? And what was exactly rescued? How was the siege and the rescue of Florence remembered in the centuries that followed? And what meaning can we find in the siege of Florence today? What meaning does it have for the Florentine citizens, for the tourists, for us in the 21st century? But before we go through these questions and follow the stories they bring, I'll begin with a quick sketch of events in their historical context, an overview that requires us to widen our focus, to pull back from San Miniato until we see all of Italy, or more accurately, what is Italy today. For in the early 16th century, where our stories begin, Italy was not yet a unified political entity. Instead, it was carved up into a patchwork of territorial states that for centuries had been jockeying with one another for power. At the turn of the 16th century, these states were facing a new threat. Increasingly, they were vulnerable to the powers north of the Alps. The decades that preceded the siege were ones of immense upheaval all over Italy, with wars involving the French, the Germans, and the Spanish, wars that redrew the political and cultural maps of the peninsula, and through a dizzying chess game of alliances, which you will thank me for ignoring. 1527 is a date in this upheaval that we must pay attention to in this talk, the date of the sack of the city of Rome by imperial troops under Charles V, who sent the Medici Pope Clement VII fleeing the Vatican Palace. The Pope survived, but the city and the Romani suffered deeply, with carnage, destruction, and humiliation, as Rome was looted and the Romans were massacred. This tragedy was also a turning point for the city of Florence. They seized in Florence the opportunity to expel the rulers, the Medici rulers, who had controlled the city of Florence directly and indirectly for almost the entire century, but winning many enemies along the way. What the Florentines hadn't counted on as they restored their republican government was that the Medici Pope, crushed by Charles and his troops, would soon forge a treaty with the imperial forces and become the emperor's ally. What cemented the papal imperial agreement was Charles's pledge to Clement. He would direct his army to defeat Florence's republican government and take back the city for the Medici. When rumors of this rapprochement first emerged, the beginning of 1528, Florence found itself in a vulnerable state. Now, if you look at this image of the city, you might think otherwise. The Veduta della Catena, or the chain map of Florence, which gets its name from the chain that surrounds this image, is a painting from the 15th century based on a xylograph by an Italian artist of the 1470s. And it captures Florence in that decade. It is the first detailed topographical map of the city. And among the many details that we could study, I draw your attention first and foremost to the fortifications. The city was surrounded in concentric circles by walls as it expanded, with this outermost set of walls begun in the late 13th century and completed throughout the next. With this system of defenses in place, the Florentines successfully fought off a siege of another emperor, Henry VII, in 1315, and at that point, there was still much work to do on these fortifications. But during this time, the technology of warfare continued to speed ahead. And so even though these walls were state-of-the-art, they were essentially becoming obsolete, even as they were going up. And I'm just going to take you through a few images here. You can see more closely the nature of these walls and the towers that dot them all the way along. Here is San Miniato to orient you a bit on this edge of the map, and I'm going to go back here. Here it is on the other side of the Arno River here. And the walls along here. This, the cannon, is why these walls were becoming obsolete. The city was especially vulnerable to cannon fire on that southern flank, the southern side of the city, where San Miniato rises and where the hills that ring Florence come very close to the walls. In fact, as you can see in this image, part of the 14th century fortifications are actually built right into the hills. So once hailed as Florence's natural protection, the hills of surrounding Florence in this new age of warfare transformed into one of its greatest threats. High above the walls, they offered the enemy the ideal vantage point to train its weapons on the city. Florence had become an easy target. The irony is that the first person to start doing anything to shore up these vulnerabilities in the early 1520s was none other than the person who had launched the attack in 1529, Giulio de' Medici, the future Clement VII, and at this point, a cardinal in Rome. There was no imminent threat from foreign powers, but especially in light of what France and the emperor were doing, he realized the importance of protecting the city while it was still under Medici rule. The question that he confronted, and one at the center of this first part of my talk, is how could Florence be protected and defended in the face of enemy assault? Still hypothetical, this question sparked a creative ferment and also heated debate among some of the most preeminent architects and military minds of the age. And I just want to go back and show you a couple of pictures of the remains of these walls and the gates in Florence today. And you can see through these photographs, as opposed to that painting, just how menacing and how powerful they were. They dwarf the cars and the people beside them. Here is one of the towers next to the gate of San Niccolò, right here on the Oltrarno. And it is here too that you can walk beside some of these walls that still stand strong, a testament again to just how effective this architecture was, even though it did remain vulnerable to these new weapons. So how do we resolve this dilemma? The first solution offered to fortify the hills on this side of the Arno River was to build fortifications that stretched from atop San Miniato all the way across the hills down to the gates on the far side of the river. This was a very unrealistic plan, however, because of the massive expense, but it was rejected for other reasons too, and by someone whom the Medici cardinal had commissioned to assess the state of the fortifications, someone by the name of Niccolò Machiavelli. By the 1520s, Machiavelli had served as a major diplomat for the Florentine Republican government. He had been exiled and tortured upon the Medici's return earlier in the century, but worked his way back into the Medici good graces years before his death in 1527. From his recently published Art of War, Libro dell'arte della guerra, Machiavelli had earned a reputation as the expert on all things military. And so in addition to citing the exorbitant price tag, he weighed in on other aspects of this design. He dismissed fortifying the hills as far too risky because of the instability of the ground, the possibility of landslides, the composition of the terrain, but also because of the potential consequences. If the newly built defenses fell into the hands of the enemy, there would be no escape for Florence. Machiavelli proposed instead an entirely different and far more controversial plan to rescue Florence, to pull the line of defenses towards the city, to rebuild the gate here at San Niccolò, and a brand new bastion at the foot of San Miniato. And what made this so controversial was because of the destruction that it entailed. Destruction not just of the existing gate and tower, but of the entire neighborhood behind the walls of San Niccolò. Destruction that would also ultimately and inevitably extend up the hillside. Machiavelli's plan meant abandoning San Miniato. The church would no longer be within the fortifications of Florence. And if the Florentines didn't knock it down first in an attempt to prevent its takeover and use by their enemy, certainly it would not survive an enemy attack. So rescuing Florence, even in this hypothetical situation, was a complicated problem to solve, with equally complicated and even paradoxical solutions. According to Machiavelli, to rescue the city, simultaneously, you had to destroy it, or at least parts of it. And you can imagine that this plan met with fierce resistance from the Florentines and also from the Medici, who settled not on Machiavelli's plan, much to his frustration, but a modified version of fortifying the hills of the Oltrarno, focusing in particular on the hill of San Miniato. And it is at this point that another name comes into the picture. And just when the hypothetical threat becomes very real. The Michelangelo we are meeting here was already well established as a sculptor and a painter. He had produced and won acclaim for the Pietà, for the statue of David in Florence, the Sistine Chapel, and was at the time working on the tombs for the Medici family when they were ousted from Florence in 1527. Michelangelo had also at this time developed a reputation as a military engineer, and this is less well known than for Leonardo da Vinci, and something that is essential for understanding what he was entrusted with by the city of Florence. Though he had been working for the Medici already in both Florence and in Rome, once the Republican government took charge and the Medici were removed, Michelangelo volunteered in 1528 his services free of charge to help refurbish and rethink the fortifications. He took on a more official role in January 1529 when he was made a member of the city's Committee on Military Affairs, which oversaw defense works. But then he was promoted even further. A few months later, in April, as it became increasingly clear that the imperial papal alliance would translate into an attack on Florence, Michelangelo was made governor and procurator general of Florence's fortifications, which gave him full authority to order and command anyone about matters related to the city's fortifications, the walls, and beyond. And in fact, beyond for him included many of the cities in Florentine territory, which he also helped to fortify. There were two main areas Michelangelo worked on with his defensive strategies. One, for the gates of the walls of the city, which he picked up from earlier plans that had been developed. And he also worked on implementing and revising a new plan for fortifying San Miniato, the most vulnerable part of the city. What is left of his work on the fortifications of the gates are 16 sketches, which are housed in the Casa Buonarroti, a delightful and very under-visited museum, which we will visit again a little bit later on in this talk. Michelangelo's sketches, two of which you see here, are amazingly creative and imaginative. They give us insight into the mind of Michelangelo, like so many of his drawings do. And they show him doing something totally new. Invention. I won't go into the details of how he was transforming the understanding of how bastions should be built and what they could accomplish. Along with this invention, we see the energy and the movement that is recognizable in so many of Michelangelo's other architectural works of the time. How many of these sketches were actually translated into real bastions is unclear. We know that he had hardly any time to put them into practice. And so when these bastions were built, they were not made of stone, but earthenwork, so wood along with earth. And so what he was planning here was a very different materials. And when you look at them, some of them have been described as being almost zoomorphic, or as if they are crustaceans. And so perhaps these were the beginnings of his planning, a time for exploring rather than finalizing. But there are some of these sketches which do seem to fit with what we understand were the bastions built at this time. The structures do seem more like they could be applied in real life. And here in this one, we see a model that seems to match very closely to the fortifications around San Miniato, the other area that he focused his attention on. So as much as Michelangelo was trying to protect the treasures of the city, as he imagined how to build these walls and these bastions. The siege itself was unleashing his own imagination. Where Michelangelo concentrated most of his attention was at San Miniato. And he spent most of his days there, sometimes around the clock, working to determine how best to strengthen the walls that had already been begun and to put his own design to work. This was personal for him, not only because he was a very spiritual man who had a kind of mystical connection, scholars believe, with the Church of San Miniato, but there was another church nearby, right next door, San Salvatore, again, rarely visited, which he considered his favorite of all of Florence, and called the simple, unadored building his beautiful farm girl. And so you have to think that as he was developing his plans and committing himself to building at a speed and with concentration unprecedented, that this was not simply for his duty to Florence, but there was something he was doing for himself. Michelangelo made the fortifications of San Miniato the linchpin in the defense of the entire city. And he made the bell tower of the church itself the highest point in the area, the highest point in all the hills, the strategic location for all these fortifications. You have here a map, the red lines of which show where we believe Michelangelo's fortifications extended. So here we have the river, we have San Miniato here, and the walls in red would surround the church, and here is San Salvatore there. It looks rather vulnerable when you realize that on all other sides of these walls would be enemy territory and the enemy itself. But the height was what made this the best location, and the bell tower in particular. Not only did Michelangelo build bastions in these fortifications where cannons would be positioned and trained to the other hills where the enemy would be encamped, but he also made the bell tower into a cannon of sorts, positioning cannons there and making that the center of all the fire. Like the sketches he did for the fortifications below, we have to think of what Michelangelo was doing here at San Miniato as a kind of living laboratory. He was figuring out as he went, and he had to move fast. Again, he was building not with stone, but with earthenworks, wood, and with the particular materials that he found there on the hills and that were brought to him from nearby. As experienced as he was with things military, he had to adapt to the particulars of this location. So he angled his fortifications in a way that would allow it to take artillery without damage. He shaped and contoured them to fit into the terrain of this complicated topography. The particular bricks he made with mud that was unbaked, so it was spongy and could absorb the impact of cannonballs. This is what he constructed the fortification with. And he used the very best wood for scaffolding as the frame underneath. Now, I am not a military engineer and cannot appreciate the extent of what he was accomplishing as he built this design. And there is so much more that I'm not including here. But I think regardless of our own expertise in the military work he did, what he produced was a masterpiece of ephemeral architecture. I wish we had it still today. As much as this work was that of Michelangelo's know-how and imagination, he needed something else to get it finished. And that is because the ruler of Florence at the time, Niccolò Capone, had serious reservations about this plan and surreptitiously tried to undermine the total authority that Michelangelo had been granted as procurator and governor general, and essentially to sabotage Michelangelo's plans. So Capone sent him on missions outside of the city, ostensibly to investigate other fortifications as useful models or to work on the fortifications he had been assigned to. And when he was gone, Capone had the fortifications Michelangelo had built knocked down. So we have dispatches from diplomats reporting about how Michelangelo would return and howl with anger and frustration that he was still playing this game with Capone when time was of the essence. So here too, saving Florence, again, involves acts of destruction. And again, it is fellow Florentines doing the destroying, not the enemy. Michelangelo was himself in some way under siege, and we owe not only his genius what he accomplished, but also his immense perseverance and his patience. At the same time, we want to temper and qualify and complicate the role that Michelangelo played in preparing the city for attack. Heroic work it was, but it was clouded by the fact that he abandoned the project in September, a month before imperial troops arrived. Exactly why he did this remains somewhat of a mystery. Perhaps he was spooked by a battle that suggested the Florentine army was ill-equipped to survive, and thinking that he would not be able to make amends with the Medici, fled the city before he was claimed to be working against them. We're not sure what drew him away, perhaps something entirely unrelated, but he was eventually lured back and forgiven by the Republican government, who, of course, desperately needed his expertise. The story muddies a bit his role in the fortifications, and yet adds, I think, a real sense of realism and humanity to Michelangelo. It's also important to qualify his accomplishment here by realizing that it is not his work alone. One of the most ingenious parts of the defense of the city and of San Miniato, and often claimed to be his own idea, was in fact not. And that idea was to cover the bell tower with mattresses stuffed with wool, which is, of course, the great export of Florence, the woolen cloth that would be finished there, and strap these woolen mattresses to the bell tower, the campanile, to absorb the blows of cannonballs that would be shot at it. It was a brilliant idea, and it worked just as brilliantly. A wonderful symbol, too, for Florence's resilience, a city, as I said, that flourished by the wool trade. And also, Michelangelo, of course, though up there and working around the clock, was not the one who built it single-handedly. There were hundreds and hundreds of workers assembled through a massive effort of recruitment within the city and the Florentine territory. They were paid with bread and wine, and they worked day and night. It was a massive project of coordinated and coerced labor. And the success of Florence's defenses hinged on their skill, on their stamina, as much as on his genius. Rescuing Florence was a collective effort in another extraordinary way, and this, more than anything, stopped me in my tracks as I was beginning to do my research on this event. The sacrifices in the name of their city were made well beyond those who labored on the hillsides to build the fortresses. And in some way, these sacrifices touched every Florentine. They grew out of the government's decision to adopt another strategy that Machiavelli had proposed, and one that he wrote about in his Art of War. Those who want to build a city should want at least 1 mile around the wall, where either farming or building would not be allowed, but should be open field where no bushes or embankments or trees or houses should exist, which would impede the vision and which should be in the rear of a besieging enemy. In other words, if Florence was to go to war, it had to adopt a scorched earth policy and clear the land in a 1 mile radius of the city's walls. In the fall of 1529, as troops of the emperor moved closer, the city issued a proclamation that adopted Machiavelli's strategies. Now, what exactly did that mean? This picture will give us some sense. You can see, if you look outside the walls, that there are lots of buildings, that Florence did not stop at the walls. And since they were completed in the 14th century and we're now at the beginning of the 16th, it's no surprise that you have little villages or borghi sprouting outside the walls, at the gates, and along the roads. There are palaces, there are artisan shops, churches, vineyards, convents, gardens, and up the slope, villas. Even in the 14th century, Giovanni Villani, who writes his Chronicle of Florence, tells us of just how elaborate and how expensive the villas are that hide in the hills around San Miniato. There was no citizen who had not built or was not building a large and rich estate in the countryside with an expensive mansion and other buildings even better than those in the city. Such a marvelous thing it was to see that most foreigners unfamiliar with Florence thought when they came from abroad that the sumptuous buildings and beautiful palaces occupying a 3-mile area around the city were part of the city itself in the manner of Rome. So anything that would potentially benefit the enemy, who would soon be setting up camp, anything that would hinder Florentine defenses, had to go. And the destruction was massive. We know from a list of properties that were evaluated right before this, the destruction happened, hundreds and hundreds of buildings that were lost. We know from the tax records of 1530, and I am choosing one from just one particular building that this tax record is in the Florentine archive, and it says essentially that the house, the main manor house and the workers' houses were destroyed, as were the olive trees and the fruit trees and the vineyards, all because this part of the land outside in the hills was made a field, which could be read as a battlefield, but also land that was razed to the ground. We also have evidence in a remarkable portrait by Jacopo Pontormo, a Mannerist artist, who painted this of a Florentine soldier, a halberdier, while the siege of Florence was going on. This painting is in the Getty Museum, which was itself under siege in wildfires last month, and thankfully it was spared. This is a remarkable study of what one scholar has identified as a not just any old soldier, but an actual individual who has been identified based on some of the heraldry and some of the intricate designs on the pin on his hat. And behind him is, we believe, the earthenwork, green because of all of the plant life that was put into it, the earthenwork of Michelangelo's bastions around San Miniato. The look of despair, of being haunted, the expression of someone looking lost is very typical of art in the Mannerist style. But we believe that the person here would have had other reasons for looking this way, because his family had a villa right below San Miniato al Monte, and it was right where that land was being raised. None of the houses survived. All were torn and burned to the ground. And so this young man's inheritance, he watched wiped out. What you have painted here is the sacrifice, and the loss, and the cost of rescuing Florence. Machiavelli had himself died more than 2 years before the proclamation was adopted, just after Florence had ousted the Medici and declared itself again a free republic. But the rescue of the city was still fundamentally grounded in his vision, his conviction that in order to save Florence, the city must be willing to destroy at least part of it. And I want to contextualize what that means exactly. Florence was celebrated for its buildings. It was identified as the remarkable works of art and architecture, and not just what Giovanni Villani had said about the villas outside. Beginning of the 15th century, the chancellor and great historian, humanist historian Leonardo Bruni, wrote this: "Just as blood spread throughout the entire body, so fine architecture and decoration are diffused throughout the city." So the physical destruction that was taking place to prepare for the impending siege tore at Florence's very identity. It was a massive sacrifice to protect the city. All this labor, all this sacrifice, all this battling was done in the months and weeks before imperial troops arrived. And it's worth underscoring that in addition to what I've characterized so far, that the act of rescuing Florence was a long and extended process. But in October of 1529, those forces did finally arrive. They started encamping in the hills around Florence, 30,000 of them. They didn't all appear at once. Florentines amassed 10,000 mercenaries and 6,000 citizen militia. Their fortresses were powerful, but by comparison, they were dwarfed, outnumbered. And what you see here on the screen is the city of Florence. You could see the fortifications of San Miniato, and then you have all the various armies of the emperor that are amassed in various places outside. Michelangelo had already sculpted the David as a symbol of Florentine pluck and toughness in the face of insurmountable odds, especially on the battlefield. And David had been associated, as in David and Goliath, with Florence for many, many years before. In San Miniato and the fortifications he built, he almost seemed to have sculpted David again. For this image, as others we will see, suggests that Florence had little chance. So what happened when the battle was engaged on 12 October 1529? The Florentines fired the first shots. A blast of cannons preceded by a flourish of horns. And then steadily for several days, they bombarded day and night the forces of the imperial troops surrounding. It was an overwhelming show of force. And here, the man behind the cannon, perched inside the bell tower of San Miniato, took full advantage of his position to attack the enemy on all sides. It was an immensely successful attack. admittedly in part because the imperial troops were still assembling and not particularly disciplined, and as it turns out, had terrible aim. They actually managed to shoot a cannonball across the river and killed the horse of the Venetian ambassador on the other side. In the coming weeks, after this initial attack from San Mignato's walls and from its campanile, the war continued on. There were some attempts to breach the walls, including the great fortifications that Michelangelo had helped to mastermind, but all of these assaults failed. It did not take long for imperial troops to be convinced that they would not succeed in breaking through the walls of the city, that they could not withstand the firepower from San Miniato, and so they abandoned the assault. The war shifted to the territory around Florence for many months, where it took the defeat of one of Florence's great commanders, Francesco Ferrucci, and the treachery of another for the war for the tide of the war to turn. Florence itself, suffering very little assault after the initial few weeks and months at the end of 1529, was subjected to a brutal war of attrition that eventually brought it to its knees in August of 1530. The casualties on the battlefield in total for the Florentines were 8,000, but the city itself suffered unbelievable losses. 30,000 people are believed to have died, most from disease and hunger. And so the rescue of Florence as a concept must also be tempered and qualified. Certainly the city within its walls, its great treasures, were spared destruction. There was no looting. It escaped the fate of Rome. But the citizens of Florence did not escape. And so that rescue was paired with unbelievable loss. It is worth pausing at this point to ask if there really was a threat that the imperial troops would bombard or overrun or sack the city of Florence. And the reason we have to ask that question is because of Clement VII, the one who worked together with imperial forces, who made that agreement with the emperor to take back the city for himself and his family. After all, Clement was the one who initiated the efforts to protect Florence in the early 1520s. It was his city too. And he expressly stated at the end of the war that when a Florentine ambassador was dispatched to plead with him to help pay the imperial armies so they don't sack the city, he was the one who agreed and ensured that the Florentines were able to satisfy those needs. And yet, I would say Clement's actions there still raise doubts when we consider what happened in the sack of Rome. The emperor did not want Rome to be sacked, but his soldiers took into their own hands their plan of attack. No one knew of the powerlessness of the commander more than Clement himself, who was holed up here in Rome in Castel Sant'Angelo while the emperor's troops were raging through his city. How could he not think that the same thing was possible also in Florence? How could he not know that he was taking an enormous gamble by bringing 30,000 troops outside its walls? Clement may have been the one who set in motion the renewal of Florence's fortifications. He may have agreed to this plan, but it's much harder to give credit to any of the Medici for rescuing Florence. On the contrary, I think we could create an argument that they contributed with great recklessness. And I wonder sometimes as I think about why the siege of Florence is not more prominent, especially in sort of popular culture. The Medici have this aura about them, and they are known as these great patrons, and their generosity and the glamour of what they have accomplished. And this doesn't fit that story, especially when you think of what happened to Clement's fellow Florentines, who were not saved within those walls. I want to bring to a close this part of the talk with one last answer to my question of how did the Florentines rescue their city in the siege? And it takes us to the 4th month in February, in the midst of the war of attrition, when hunger and disease were already plaguing the citizens. The Florentine soldiers on 17 February set out to show that despite what was going on, their spirits were unbroken. And they did so by playing the Partita dell'Assedio, a soccer match. They chose their location very strategically. It was in the Piazza Santa Croce, which I've circled here on the map. And they did so because the troops stationed all the way over here, you can sort of see my cursor, you know where San Miniato is. It was within full view of the enemy. The troops stationed on the hillside could see them, they could hear them, and hear them they did, because apparently the Florentine soldiers not only played loudly in the piazza, and there is Santa Croce from that map, but they sent musicians up on the roof to make a lot of noise and attract the attention of the soldiers up in the hills. And where these soldiers could pick them off very easily. And in fact, they did shoot cannonballs at them as they played soccer and failed once again to hit any of their targets. We are fine, we are not afraid, was the message they were sending, totally exposed in the piazza. Through this move, the Florentines rescued something very essential to the city and essential to who they were. They preserved their spirit, their dignity, and their pride. And they did so not with a cannonball, with a soccer ball. And instead of a battlefield, one of play. And here's an image from the 17th century. It looks very orderly. I don't think that was probably the case. I'm cheating a little bit by taking an image not from the time, but we don't have any, certainly, of this first match that was played in February. In the first part of my talk, I've been careful to try to reconstruct the stories that document the siege of Florence using the materials, the sources of the time. Dispatches from diplomats, tax records. I've drawn on the work of historians who have used these and other sources. But we find a lot more about the siege in the years that follow it. We must be careful how we read some of that material, aware that the context in which it was written and for whom it was written, by whom it was written, has shaped and reshaped the memory of the siege in various ways. And it is a fascinating collection of materials in a different way from those that I have interpreted when talking about the rescue of Florence at the time. I have tried to bring out how this rescue grew out of a clash of ideas and of wills, out of expertise, of talent, of brilliant Florentine minds, hard labor, raw strength, and staggering sacrifice, along with defiance, resilience, and courage. What do we see in the siege when we move past 1529? How is the memory of it preserved and used, and why? I can't hope to answer these questions in full, and I have only a few examples to show you, but they're very revealing, and they show you how the siege continued to survive and play a vital role in Florence well beyond the months that it lasted. And we will start with Benedetto Varchi, who despite the date of 1729, or 1721 rather, the date of publication of his History of Florence, himself lived in the 16th century, an accomplished humanist of wide-ranging interests. He became the official historian of Duke Cosimo I, the Medici, the most important of the Medici rulers subsequent to their return after the siege. He had been present, lived through, and taken copious notes during these events, and he had been on the Republican side. Like many, he changed allegiances to the Medici and was embraced by this new regime. And when he wrote his History of Florence, he made sure that much of his work focused on those years of upheaval, the revival of the Republic in 1527, and especially on the months of the siege itself. Varchi's work is filled with fascinating stories and details of these 10 months. But there's one in particular that attracted my attention, and that is when the Florentine government proclaims the scorched earth policy for the 1-mile radius around the city. This is what Varchi writes. What they did, and they being the Florentine government, was either extremely wise or, apologies, that should be an R instead of an F, extremely wise or immensely foolish. And it should be forever praised or condemned, but nevertheless admired. So he's conflicted, ambivalent about what it all added up to. And then he writes, and I am still more astonished now as I am writing about than when I was when I watched it happen. As I remember the crowds of young men going from one villa to another, with owners themselves often joining them. And not only were they bringing down houses at a great clip, but they were destroying the orchards and gardens, either by tearing everything up by the roots or cutting down the vines, the rose bushes, the cedars, the olive trees, so that they could be used for the bastions. From these images of destruction, he shifts to a more technical description of battering rams that were employed, how they were used, including men who would shout encouragements to one another as they broke through the walls of their houses, like sailors at sea, he says, as they drove giant weapons through their walls. Given how momentous the nature of these events were, it may initially be surprising that Varchi doesn't go into any more detail than what we see here. Should we be concerned? But if he writes with economy, he chooses his words to great effect. And it is worth pausing to pay closer attention. Varchi's sketch of the destruction emphasizes the speed and the zeal with which the Florentines responded to this gut-wrenching call. He talks about the furia with which they knocked down these structures. And at the same time, he draws our attention to the sheer number of people who participated, not individuals. They are frotte, the crowds, and also about the spontaneity of their action. He tells of the systematic approach that others took as they went from one structure to another. And perhaps the most arresting is his eyewitness reporting of the owners of these houses tearing them down with their very own hands. It is a stark image that communicates very clearly his wonder, his amazement at what he saw, but it also brings into focus that what he saw is undeniably admirable. What he saw was undeniably admirable. We are witnessing in his account something heroic, indeed almost superhuman, the highest form of self-sacrifice in the name of the public good. Just as important for understanding this section in Book 10 of Varchi's work is what he unfolds in his previous book, much of it dedicated to an introduction to the city, its history, and its physical structure. While framing it as a digression, Varchi also maintains that it was both useful and necessary. And I think he's absolutely right. There is one lengthy chapter dedicated to the city's gates, And Varchi goes through all 19 of them. And with each one, he gives an inventory of what is there. So for example, in the Oltrarno Sanfrediano, he says, the Borgo is busy with houses and churches and hospitals and shops and taverns. He also notes the beautiful villas and the incredible number of palaces, palazzi, big houses. He concludes about San Niccolò at the other end of the fortifications in the Oltrarno. He says, there are so many little villages outside of the walls that you could consider them a city unto themselves. It is this sentence that Varchi recalls as he begins his sketch of tearing down these vibrant parts of Florence. And it is with that equation that he invites us to recall not just the wealth of information he gives us in Book 9, but the vibrancy of life of Florence outside those walls. Varchi helps us to understand why he is so conflicted about this destruction. Remember, he tells us at the beginning, right? It was either extremely wise or immensely foolish, praised perhaps, but perhaps to be condemned. Having first brought these parts of Florence to life in Book 9, Varchi lets us see how wonderfully heroic and at the same time how horrifically tragic, how praise and respect is simultaneously a stinging indictment of his government's decision. The most famous image of the siege of Florence, the one on my very first slide, is the one you see here. Giovanni Stradano's fresco of the siege that you will find in the Palazzo Vecchio. It dates to the 1550s. It is breathtaking in scope, in its detail, and it is part of a massive program of paintings in this building celebrating the victories of the Medici family and victories of Florence. This particular painting is not one that you are able to see very easily unless you are the guest of the mayor, because this is his office, the room of Clement VII, which is dedicated to all of the accomplishments and victories of his reign. So what do we see when we look at this image? And I have quite deliberately not used it when talking about the events themselves, because it is a real distortion. What we see perhaps first are the imperial troops who are blanketing the hillsides. Here are their tents, the little pyramids of white. They are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. They are organized and orderly and dominant. Perhaps not so much a menace as they are a presence, and clearly an inescapable one. The angle that Stradano has used here also serves to make their camps seem larger and stronger and perhaps inevitably victorious. And in contrast, you have to look a lot harder to see the Florentine troops and to spot a place that was really the center and the leader in this battle, and that is San Miniato. It is all the way over here, not centered at all. And let's take a close-up so that we can see it in relation to the imperial troops and their fortifications here. So first, San Miniato is minimized quite deliberately in this painting, which, as you may remember, celebrates the Medici, commissioned by the Medici, not likely to make them look like the defeated that they were when this battle was taking place. But you also have another kind of careful strategic decision and distortion in making this hill, Giramonte, where the imperial troops are gathered, taller, higher than what we see here, San Miniato. That is categorically false. This painting gives the impression that they were the ones who dominated, as well because it is their cannons that are firing, whereas in reality, it was the cannons situated here in the Campanile of San Miniato that were winning the day. And if we take a look back at the picture in full, I want us to look at those fortifications, which again are wrapped around the city in immense detail. Everything about this suggests that it is accurate, and there are certainly ways in which mathematically the artist has worked very carefully to create the accurate perspective as well as detail. But the fortifications look incredibly small and very inadequate. They're almost decorative rather than substantive. And here, again, what dominates is the city itself, its unmistakable dome, and the forces that are on the outside. The rescue of Florence by the Florentines of the city of Florence is essentially erased in the city, and history is being rewritten. There's much more to say about this painting, but I want to show you one more as we think about the memory of these events. And this is an image of Michelangelo. We have traveled down the street, made a few turns, and we are at Casa Buonarroti, where you saw those sketches of the fortifications for the gates of the city. And here we see a painting among many that were commissioned in the 17th century. Here we have Michelangelo below the hill of San Miniato with the church in the distance and his beloved church right below it, directing the building of the bastions. Now, there are a lot of things about this painting that are also distorted, beginning with the fact that you have in the background peeking through the cupola of the cathedral, and it is not there. It would be behind the soldier, the representative of the Florentine government who is standing here. So this is symbolic, so that you know where you are. So perhaps you associate Michelangelo and what he accomplished with the saving of the city and its treasures, among them the Duomo. We also look at Michelangelo's clothes and probably think it is very unlikely he is wearing silk or satin and this very attractive hat when he is out there knee-deep in mud directing this very messy building of the bastions. And even more so because Michelangelo had a reputation for being a total slob and was very proud of it. And Leonardo da Vinci used to tease him because he was very much the courtier in how he dressed. So this is an image of Michelangelo that is emphasizing his greatness in a way that masks some of the reality. You have him pointing to San Miniato, someone there with his model for what he has done, and he is dominating this picture, clearly, working interestingly in cooperation with a representative of the government. And we know that there was instead great conflict, disagreement, a battle with the Florentine ruler when he was building this. That is masked, as is the fact that Michelangelo disappeared in the middle of creating these fortifications. So this particular image celebrates and elevates Michelangelo in a way that, that polishes up that more complex picture I painted at the beginning. At the same time, it does give credit where credit is due. And along the back here are the shadowy figures of people toiling as they build the fortifications. So Michelangelo's portrait painter here was acknowledging that there were others who were involved in the creation. And here is a close-up of that as well. A final few words. Finding the siege in Florence today. The siege and the rescue of Florence are part of the fabric of the city that you can travel to and visit today. Although it may be hard to see right away. If you think of the city of Rome as a city of many layers, with columns casually sticking out of a medieval building that's part of a new trattoria, in Florence, the layers are a little more difficult to peel back. You cannot see, for example, the original fortifications of San Miniato that Michelangelo built. They were impermanent. But if you walk around them, if you walk around San Miniato, you will see that there, at a later date in the 16th century, there was a fortification that was recreated largely based on Michelangelo's model. So only small modifications. You can get some idea of what it would have looked like. You can also see the campanile from which Lupo fired his cannonballs that show scars that withstood through the woolen shields the fire of the imperial army. There are no markers, interestingly, about the siege of Florence that I have found anyway in this part of the city, but surrounding the wall is a cemetery for those who fell in World War I. And so it is in some ways a commemoration of the battlefield that was there in the 1520s. If you step outside or if you hike your way up the hill, you will be moving through what I consider possibly the most beautiful part of Florence, as you can see in these images here. And if you squint, you can think of this landscape that you are looking at as the one dotted with olive groves and villas and houses. And you can also imagine the loss as you see these fade from your eyes. You can't do that entirely because part of the mountain has now been carved out into an enormous square, piazzale, which appropriately enough is the Piazzale Michelangelo. This was done in the 19th century when Florence was the capital of Italy. Some would say they hollowed out this hill instead of carved it out, and you get spectacular views of the city from here. It is very famous and very appropriately entitled Michelangelo, although it was not the designer's intent to commemorate his accomplishments here. And if you happen to be in Florence in February, the 17th precisely, you can go to see the Partita dell'Assedio, which takes place every 17th of February in that square. It is not the one that happens in June for San Giovanni. This is kind of the old-timer game. And I had the great pleasure not only of going, but of watching the cook at my local trattoria play for the Bianchi. The siege is alive and well. And if you can't get to Florence, you can see the former mayor of Florence, Matteo Renzi, who decided that he would make a series of videos about the greatness of the city, and one of those videos was about the siege. And no surprise, because his office, of course, has that picture in the background. Renzi's video raises an important question, and one I'd like to leave you with. And that is, how does the siege of Florence and the rescue of Florence resonate today? What meanings could it have for us? And it's hard not to, just lost my page here. It is hard not to associate the word siege with a different kind of siege that is going on in the city today. Over tourism. This may sound melodramatic, but the language of siege and warfare and invasion is not my own invention, nor is it new. Mary McCarthy, distinguished writer and intellectual, who wrote The Stones of Florence back at the end of the 1950s, talked about the invasion of tourists, the hordes who were coming into the city. And then we have more modern headlines like this one, which uses the word besieged. And it's not just the language of siege, you also have that of rescue. Here you have those drop boxes for the keys for the Airbnbs, covered over with tape that says, Salviamo Firenze. Salviamo Firenze viverci, so that we can live there. These signs are everywhere in Florence, and especially in the Oltrarno district today, which was where I had the great privilege of living in 22 and 23. Traditionally a proud working class part of the city, increasingly consumed by Airbnbs, and a few years ago, in one of the most popular travel guides, it was anointed the hippest neighborhood in all of Europe. The government is responding with various new measures. Here we have Sara Funaro, who's announced very recently a 10-point plan to combat over-tourism. But this plan has won praise as well as criticism for those who claims that her policies and others have brought these problems on themselves. And so you have instead flyers that I would see posted every few weeks in the Oltrarno, calling people to neighborhood meetings. For anyone who lives around the clock in the old city center in the Oltrarno and in certain neighboring zones of Disneyland Florence, which has been Venetianized by the phenomena of tourism and eateries, what is our future? And I am most struck by a sign that was spray painted. Right down the street from Piazza Tasso, tourists go home, refugees welcome. I was struck by this because the parallels with the 1520s are intriguing. This person wanted to save the city of Florence by defacing it. The Machiavelli paradox, to save you must destroy. But just like in Florence of 1529, not everybody agreed with his strategy. And the next day, I kid you not, that graffiti was gone. So you see here Florentines wrestling with vulnerability. It's strange to call it this. The city's treasure of its history, its art, and its architecture. It's inescapable. It's built into the city, the same way that the hills of the Oltrarno, sloping down to its walls, were also an integral part, making it so vulnerable to attack. So what is it going to take to protect Florence from this siege? How much will the mayor's 10-point plan accomplish? And will Florence be able to find its own Michelangelo? What sacrifices will the Florentines have to make? These are urgent questions in a slow motion siege of sorts, and I don't have the answers myself, but what I propose is that by knowing about the siege of 1529 and 30 and about how the Florentines sought to rescue the city, everything from its sacred buildings to its dignity and its spirit, and it might be able to help to guide us as we think about the immense challenges of over-tourism today. And the reason why is that we can see things around us differently when we view them through the lens of the past. And this is one of the great revelations, one of the great joys that students in the Graduate Liberal Studies program experience as they read the text from the past and see new things in their own world as a result. The siege of Florence and how the Florentines sought to rescue their city can help us to sharpen our questions and understand the dynamics of over-tourism today, can give us insights into this problem and maybe even into some of the solutions. And maybe after this talk, it already has. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor O'Brien, for this insightful talk. And now we can open the floor to a short Q&A. There are microphones on the aisles, on each side of the aisle. So please, if you'd like to ask any questions or just, provoke a discussion on different ways of being besieged, please share your questions with us. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your illuminating lecture on the history of Florence City. I'm very curious about the technology of cannonball. My understanding is industrialization came in the 19th century. So how was the enemy of Florence City able to scale up the massive production of cannonball to attack Florence City in terms of chemistry, in terms of logistics and factory?
Just the production of cannonballs. Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I have no idea what the answer. I wish I did. I have spent so little time on the sort of the military engineering dimension of this, and yet it's obviously critical, right? Because the success of both sides really depended on the fact that they would be able to bombard steadily, right, over a stretch of time. Yes, I open the floor to anybody in the audience who has expertise in this area. Yes, please.
I wanted to maybe expand that the idea of cannonballs, if it's metal, it would have to be what, casted? And in the tradition, the Italian craftsmen in metal, and we could think, well, bell tower. So those bells would have to be cast in a very, a precise way. And if I understand, it was almost like a spiritual way that they would be like making their prayers while they're making the metal, while they're making the forms. And so maybe that was a way to like serve the church as humble craftsmen being able to serve the church and Florence in that way. And I mean, I'm also interested in like Italian cars and Ferraris. And that's also like crafting the metal.
Yeah.
But the highest form of the craft wasn't the casting the metal. It was the form maker. So they would be working with the wood in very precise way. So each step we go back, and that it takes a team to serve the church, and it takes a team to serve Florence. You're sort of sending me back maybe my young times in Florence 30 years ago. And
Good.
Such a small space in time, you've expanded in such a rich way that Leonardo was like Renaissance man, always so respected. You see his architect drawings and his war machinery, as well as his paintings. And Michelangelo always seems to have that shorthand of he sculpted the marble, he was the painter. And I want to thank you for the richness of the architecture, his involvement with trying to save, preserve the culture of its times. Now, just a short question. I don't know if you know that either, but you talked about how much labor, whether it's military labor or the building of the bastions and that kind of thing. I think you used the word coerced labor or coerced.
Yes.
Are you saying slaves, or can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, I mean, they literally, in
Thank
order
you.
to, yes, thank you for that. In order to accomplish what they had to do, in order to finish these fortifications, knowing that the imperial army was making its way up at a fairly steady clip from Rome, they needed as many people as possible to work. And so they started by going into the Florentine territory, and they literally took people away from their farms and had them come and do this work. And as I say, they paid them only in bread and wine. And then eventually, because things weren't getting done fast enough, the citizens of Florence took over or joined those forces as well. Some of them did so voluntarily, but not all of them did. So coerced by the government, yes, and the Florentine government extended its power at this point over quite an extensive territory.
So in this era, there wasn't anything like black slaves
There
or anything
were
like
there
that?
were slaves. I'm not. It's a yes. There were. I'm not aware of any slaves doing any work on these fortifications, and they were not in great numbers.
Well,
and-
thanks for that richness.
Yeah.
I think of that when I hear about some of maybe the recent descriptions of Pompeii
Mhm.
and maybe the bakeries and what was the local labor, what was the
Right.
Italian labor, and what was like slaves. So
Thank you.
thank you so much for the richness tonight.
Are there any other questions? Yes?
No.
Sorry to confess, how do you think of the relationship between late stage capitalism and mass tourism?
I don't think I can take that on right now. That's another talk perhaps. But there's a connection to be explored. The Florentines, of course, are yeah. I'll leave it to others to ask, but there is another question over here. Thank you.
Hi, first of all, thank you for your inspiring and insightful presentation. I just want to go back to Florence and visit all these places that you mentioned. So my question is, I was really struck by how strong the civic sense of this citizen, the Fiorentini,
Yes.
was. One of your slide was really, the description was really striking, you know.
Yeah.
These owners, villas owners walking through their properties with practically young people that were destroying that. So my question is, do you think it's a peculiarity of, of the Fiorentini? And if so, what is your insight into that? Why? Oh, it was also common in other cities, you know, and because it was very complicated map at the time in Italy. And so maybe that was something, the sense of your city and was maybe more spread out that I imagine. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, and it's so important. It's actually at the heart of my research project right now, which is on civic consciousness and where it comes from and how it is presented and experienced by the citizens, by the government, and how it is written about in the works of Italian humanists who very much drew on ancient Rome and specifically Cicero to talk about that civic spirit and to try to inspire people to make those sacrifices. So a fuller answer to your question will be forthcoming as I continue to do my research. But ultimately, this is what attracted me so much to that idea of destroying your own property, your own livelihood, and by doing it, by so many citizens accepting it, if not embracing it. I don't think it was peculiar to Florence to have a strong sense of civic identity. I think it was essential in the period of the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and it was something that was very consciously cultivated by city-states, in part to try to limit the centrifugal forces of, my family is the most important, first and foremost, or, my political party is more important. And so these divided loyalties were ones that they tried to compete they had to compete with. And so the city worked very hard in various ways with words, with art and architecture, with rituals to help promote that civic sense. We have so much of it preserved in Florence for this period, and so much of it has been studied in Florence to the point, earlier in the 20th century that the scholarship seemed to think that all of it really developed in that city as a result of challenges to it, especially military ones. But I do think other cities experienced it, perhaps somewhat differently, but it is one of the most compelling elements and certainly something that I hope in my own work to be able to shed further light on, precisely the questions you're asking. Grazie.
Sorry, could I just ask a quick follow-up to that question? So this sense of civic duty, the Republic of Florence, what was it that led them to drive the Medici out and then to reestablish a republic when all around them they had all of these outside external forces? It must have told them that their resistance was not going to be an easy thing to pull off to save the republic. So was that tied to the sense of civic duty, or was there something else going on politically at the time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you look at certain documents, and you will see articulated very explicitly that sense of civic duty. That sense of civic duty and responsibility, very much outlined as the the message of the government itself. There was a lot more that was at work there. A lot of it was sort of long-standing personal grievances with the Medici family and how they had been ruling, and there were also, in this particular case, a really significant religious element, because the republic that was established and reestablished was deeply influenced by the ideas of Savonarola from the previous century. And so his followers and their very radical spiritual beliefs informed the reestablishment of the republic, to the point that the Niccolò Caponi insisted on Jesus Christ being recognized as really the head of the Florentine Republic when it was reestablished in 1527. So there is that legacy, along with these other ones belonging to centuries of persecution that many felt by the Medici family, but also a long, long tradition of a sense of the Florentines are Republicans. This is where our identity is. This is our responsibility, and we must live up to it by bringing back that rightful government, which brings justice to all of us. Yeah.
If there are no other questions, on behalf of the Dante Society and SFU's Graduate Liberal Studies, I would like to thank you, all of you, for being such a beautiful audience. And I would like to invite you for some light refreshments and continue the conversation together and create the spirit of community and collaboration among us through Italy and through the Renaissance Florence upstairs. Thank you very much.
So good. I can't believe you pulled that off.
It was long. I hadn't had time to go through it all. I can't either.
Pronto?
Bene? Infatti, ecco perché sì. Poi di lì, sapete Cristina? Been to our house a few times. È cresciuto un po', mi sa. Sì, è più grande, più alto e più grande. Allora.
No, è scuola, ma adesso sto cercando. Se rimango a Vancouver, meglio. Devo andare a un'altra città. IT, information technology.
Difficile, devo dire la verità. Ma... Sì, andiamo a trovare Tony. Lui aveva un'altra, è vero, è perché allora, io vado qua con lui, ma tu vai lì, poi ci troviamo dopo. Ok, ok, e quindi ragazze? Dove?
Montreal.
A Montreal? A McGill?
No, no, andate a lavorare.
A lavorare.
L'Oreal.
Ok, allora.
Sono contento.
Sì.
A me piace Montreal, quindi va bene, andava a trovare.
Allora,
È venuta nostalgia di Firenze. Gli è venuta nostalgia di Firenze.
io devo dire la verità, quando ho visto Miniato la prima volta e poi...
Penso a San Miniato, sono stato con la classe del liceo. Se no, Piazzale Michelangelo e poi via.
Mi ricordo San Miniato, quando